This is contemporary British politics, and we are on class number 11, and the topic today is going to be British foreign policy. And I thought we would begin by having a look at two stories, which, as ever, I have taken from the Guardian website, from the British foreign policy section. And this one, I thought we would start off with. I think the two stories incidentally illustrate quite nicely the fact that Britain plays a role in various different parts of the world. So let's start off with this one. The headline say UK pledges to back Sweden and Finland against Russian threats. Boris Johnson travels to sign security pacts with two countries which are considering NATO membership. So this is obviously a reference to the fact that recently, as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, both Sweden and Finland now seem to be seriously considering becoming members of NATO, perhaps even more than just seriously considering, but that they're on the brink of actually becoming members of NATO. And that is actually a transformation. I mean, I know we're talking about British politics, but just as an aside, and as somebody who's quite interested in European security issues, that is an absolute transformation in Swedish and Finnish foreign and security policies, because these two countries traditionally have been neutral. They've been outside NATO. Finland, both Sweden and Finland are sort of members of the European Union, but they are not members of NATO, and that has historically been a sort of core part of both countries' identity. The crisis in Ukraine has obviously forced both governments to reevaluate their relationship with NATO, and it seems, as I said, that they're on the brink of joining. From a British political perspective, I think this story is interesting because it illustrates the fact that Britain actually does perform quite an important role in Europe's security system. So last week we talked quite a lot about Britain's relationship with Europe, and obviously we discussed Brexit at length and the reason why Britain's relationship historically with the European Union, before that the European Community, had always been quite difficult, and we mentioned the fact that historically Britain has been quite sceptical of supranationalism and things like that. On the other hand, it's worth noting that even though Britain has withdrawn from the European Union, it still plays a very important role in Europe's security system. Britain is still a member of NATO, and Boris Johnson's trips to Sweden and Finland. I'm not sure if he's still there or if he's back to London. But it does illustrate quite nicely, I think, that Britain is still a relatively heavyweight actor, let's say, in the European security system, and that's a point that I would like to sort of address perhaps in a bit more detail later. But anyway, Johnson apparently, as the story there suggests, has promised both countries that they can count on British support if Russia takes some kind of action against them. It's worth noting, in fact, that Britain's own relationship with Russia is, to say the least, extremely difficult, and we might get onto some of the reasons for that a little bit later. But as I say, I think the story quite nicely illustrates the fact that even though Britain is now outside of the European Union, it still is quite an important actor in the European security system, and I'll discuss in a moment some of the reasons why Britain is actually still quite an important actor in that system. And another story that again I found on the Guardian website in the British Foreign Policy section, and as with the other story, there's a nice little link here if you're interested in looking at that in a bit more detail. But the reason I selected this is, again, I think it illustrates quite nicely another aspect of British foreign policy. So again, the headline: Caribbean states warn against direct rule of British Virgin Islands. Former colonies condemn retrograde proposal that UK override local democracy to tackle corruption. And this is a story concerning the fact that recently the government in the British Virgin Islands, so I should say the British Virgin Islands, as their name suggests, they are actually they do actually belong to Britain still. So they are basically a colony. So even though Britain has lost virtually all of its empire, there are still a sort of smattering of possessions in various parts of the world. So, mainly sort of lumps of rock and small islands spread across the world, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, Pacific, and places like that. And this is one of them. Now, although it is British, it does have its, or I should say, it did have its own government, but the political situation there apparently is quite chaotic. I won't claim to have followed this in any great detail, but I did notice that the head of government in the British Virgin Islands was actually arrested in Miami, which isn't geographically is not that far away, on drugs charges. And this apparently is posing something of a dilemma for the British government, and there seems to be some sort of consideration that the British might actually introduce direct rule over these islands, meaning that they would be governed directly from London. Probably, I suspect, on a temporary basis. I don't think there was probably much appetite within the British government to take over these islands on a long-term basis. But that this is a proposal that apparently is being actively considered. But this proposition apparently is quite controversial, and there are other governments in the Caribbean, so other islands, independent states within the Caribbean, who are reacting quite strongly against this idea. The reason, again, why I've sort of selected this is it illustrates another aspect. The fact that, first of all, Britain is a former sort of colonial power. So Britain used to have an empire, and that still actually is quite an important influence on British foreign policy. But also the fact that Britain still does actually have possessions. Not many, or at least geographically, they are not large, so most of the British Empire has disappeared. But as I said, there are a sort of smattering of islands right the way around the world, of which the British Virgin Islands are among them. And that, I think, is quite important when thinking about British foreign policy, because it sort of illustrates the fact that British foreign policy is actually quite global. Unlike, let's say, a country, well, to take an example, Poland, which obviously is right in the middle of Europe. And if you think about Polish foreign policy, which I do, it's obviously very, very European centric, because Poland's interests are very much entrenched in Europe. Poland is obviously worried about what Russia is doing, and its relations with Germany are obviously of critical importance to Poland. In the case of Britain, yes, Britain's relations with European countries are also very important, especially with France, which is Britain's closest neighbour, but also Germany and various other, and for that matter, Poland as well. The British-Polish relationship, I think, is actually quite important. But Britain, as I say, Britain is engaged in other parts of the world as well. So it's not just the case that Britain is focused sort of exclusively on Europe, but it has, important bilateral relations with a number of other states in different parts of the world, notably America. And we'll come back to that, because the British like to think that they have a sort of special relationship with the United States. But also countries which were once colonies of the UK, So the relationship with India, I think, is quite interesting, to take one example. Singapore might be another. And then, as I say, there are still various sort of entities, possessions, if you like, right the way across the world, which might actually be sort of self-governing, but which are still notionally part of I wouldn't say the British Empire, but the British Commonwealth. So and which the British clearly still have quite a strong interest. So British foreign policy, I think, is much more globalized than many other sort of European countries. I mean, I mentioned Poland, but Germany would be another example of a country whose interests are focused pretty strongly on Europe. I'm not saying Germany has no interests outside Europe, of course not. It's a trading state, but for the most part, its focus is heavily concentrated on Europe. Britain, as I said, by virtue of the fact that it once had an empire and that it was once right at the centre, if you like, of a global trading system. By virtue of these facts, British foreign policy is much more, I would say, sort of globalised than many of its sort of European counterparts. Another country which is quite similar to Britain would be France, and again, because France historically too also had quite a big sort of empire in North Africa and places like that. So yeah, these are very much, as I say, quite important elements within British foreign policy. And before we go any further, I thought we'd start with our usual cartoon as well. The Battle of Brexit, it says here, with Trafalgar sort of crossed out. Trafalgar is one of the great sort of British battles. It was a naval battle between Britain and Napoleonic France in I'm trying to remember now. I think it was 1812, but again, I'll probably need to check that. Anyway, it resulted in a very sort of decisive defeat of the French Navy, so it's celebrated today. The admiral who was in charge, I suppose, who was in command, is probably a better way of saying it, during the battle was Admiral Nelson. He was mortally wounded in that battle. So he was killed. He was injured, but he eventually died from his injuries. And he is, he's he became a sort of national hero. To this day, we have Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square, right in the centre of London. So yes, this cartoon is obviously a sort of a pastiche of this. So it's Battle of Brexit here, and it's a reference to some of the clashes between British and French fishing vessels in the Channel. There's a disputes about fishing rights and things like that following on from Brexit. Okay, right. Let's move on to the next slide. And if we were doing this actually in class, this would be the question I would ask you. But seeing as you're not here, apologies, I cut off the video momentarily. Sorry. So I was saying, seeing as you're not here, I will reveal the PowerPoint for you. And the broad point I would make is that Britain is a member of several quite important international organisations, and this is and the British sometimes like to claim, or the British government sometimes like to claim, this enables Britain to punch above its weight, meaning that perhaps Britain has more influence in world affairs than its sort of size and the size of its economy and various other factors might actually suggest. Okay, a couple of things to mention. First and foremost, I would say this is perhaps one of Britain's. This is a privilege that very few other countries have. Britain is a P5 member of the United Nations Security Council. I probably should have said Security Council after the first point there. It's slightly misleading. What does that mean? It basically means that Britain is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So the Security Council is within the United Nations probably the most important organ, in the sense that this is the council that is usually convened in order to respond to various international crises. The council is composed of 15 members, and there are 5 permanent members. So these are 5 countries which are always on the Security Council. And then there are 10 elected members, and the 10 members are elected for a 2-year term. And fairly recently, Poland was actually on the Security Council, but its tenure has now come to an end. The 5 permanent members are Britain, France, the United States, China, and Russia. And the other privilege they have, apart from always sitting on the council, is that each of the 5 permanent members can actually veto a United Nations Security Council resolution, which is important because a UN Security Council resolution is binding. It becomes part of international law. So this basically enables any one of the P5 members to basically block a Security Council resolution. Why is Britain on the P5? Which again would be a question I would ask if we were in class. The short answer, though, to that question is that the Security Council basically reflects the world in 1945, which was when the Security Council was actually established. And in 1945, the 5 big powers were on the winning side of the Second World War, and these, obviously, as I say, Britain, United States, Soviet Union, France, which was sort of treated as a victor power, and also China. So these were the 5 who were sort of given this sort of privilege. Now, obviously, the world has sort of changed quite drastically in the intervening 70 or so years since the end of the Second World War. And, there are plenty of people who argue that the Security Council sort of needs to be reformed, and that perhaps countries like Germany and Japan, maybe even India, Brazil, countries like that should be given some sort of representation, some sort of permanent representation on the Council. Unsurprisingly, though, the British and the French and other countries are sort of resisting this. They obviously, the British quite like the fact that they have this sort of privileged position in international affairs. So the fact that Britain, as I say, is a P5 member sort of separates Britain from many other countries. Only France within Europe has a sort of similar status as the UK. And as I say, that is the one privilege that the British have that does actually sort of separate the UK from most other countries. Whether or not we should still have it is certainly up for debate. The British would the British government would make the argument that, yes, obviously we are now a much more sort of diminished power. In 1945, Britain's had the world's 2nd largest economy. Britain's obviously been sort of relegated, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But the British would argue, by virtue of their history, their political values and all the rest of it, that they should still nevertheless have a seat on the council. Obviously, other countries might take issue with that idea. NATO, right. Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, Britain is a NATO member. So although we are now currently outside, well, I say currently, but for the foreseeable future, at the very least, we are outside the European Union. Britain is nonetheless a member of NATO, and we are actually quite an important member of NATO because Britain actually does spend a sizable percentage of its economy on defence, similar to Poland. So over 2% of the UK economy is devoted to defence. In all probability, given the current security situation in Europe, that percentage is likely to increase in the years ahead. And because Britain has one of the world's larger economies, again, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment, that means that in absolute terms, Britain is one of the world's biggest defence spenders, which gives Britain a fair amount of political weight inside NATO. Now, obviously, British defence expenditure is dwarfed by that of the United States. The United States spends more on defence than several of the other big spending countries combined, and again we'll take a look at that. But within, let's say, European NATO, the fact that Britain is one of the biggest defence spenders gives Britain a significant voice, let's say, in European security issues. And again, as I said, maybe I'll skip back a moment to our previous story. This story sort of illustrates that. The fact that it's Boris Johnson going to Sweden and not the German Chancellor or something like that. I mean, I suppose it could have been the German Chancellor, but the fact that it is Britain, I think, sort of reflects the fact that Britain does have a certain weight inside NATO. The European Union, obviously, not so much anymore, but until 2020, Britain was an EU member. The British obviously withdrew, and Boris Johnson played a very instrumental role in facilitating Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. There's a big debate about the consequences of this in terms of British foreign policy. Let's say the pro-Brexit view would say that this now gives Britain much more room for manoeuvre and will allow Britain to sort of engage in other parts of the world. Boris Johnson's big mantra is global Britain. So his vision is for Britain to be much more sort of actively engaged in the Pacific region, maybe Southern Asia, places like that. Critics of Brexit would argue that Britain's departure from the EU has actually diminished its status. It's given Britain less influence. And arguably, you could suggest, let's say, that the Ukraine crisis has reflected this in the sense that Britain has not actually had a direct voice within European councils in terms of the way that the EU, and obviously the EU is composed of several very important European states, Germany, France, Italy, etc. The way the EU has sort of responded to these developments. So perhaps Brexit has diminished Britain. Others, as I say, would argue that no, it's sort of liberated Britain and allowed Britain, as I say, to play a bigger role. One thing I think the Ukraine crisis has sort of illustrated is that Europe is still very important. Developments in Europe can have a very direct impact on British interests. And the fact that Britain is outside the EU, again, that sort of raises the question as to whether or not Brexit has necessarily enhanced this. The Commonwealth is mainly composed of ex-British colonies, and it's an international organisation, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. The British Virgin Islands, which we mentioned a moment ago, would be very much part of it. And again, it sort of reflects the fact that British foreign policy does have this sort of global dimension to it. And then two other organisations we could mention, the G7, which is a sort of exclusive group of what were once the world's sort of biggest industrial economies. Today, I suppose you might describe them as the sort of mature industrial economies, mainly Europe, North America, plus Japan. And again, the fact that the British have a seat at that table sort of reflects the fact that Britain is a sizable player, let's say, on the world stage. But it's also a reflection of British history. The fact that I think it was the 70s, the G7 was established. Back then Britain was one of the biggest economies in the world. Since then, other countries have sort of emerged, but this fairly sort of exclusive club still carries a fair amount of weight. More recently, we've also seen the emergence of the G20, which is basically the G7 plus several other countries, many of them sort of emerging economies, including the so-called BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And again, that might be, you could see that as a sort of reflection of the fact that the mature economies, their position in global politics has perhaps deteriorated or weakened in the last couple of in the last, let's say, the last couple of decades or so, and that other countries are beginning to have sort of more weight, let's say, in the global system. Let's move on to the next slide, and here we have a quotation from Dean Acheson, who said this, I think, in 1962. Dean Acheson was a former American Secretary of State, so the guy responsible for American foreign policy in the Truman administration. He was Secretary of State during Truman's second term as president. Obviously, by 1962, he had retired. He was no longer in the American government, but he was very much seen as a sort of senior international statesman. And as the quotation, I won't read it all, but as the quotation here illustrates, he says, "Great Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role." This is a very famous sort of statement about Britain in the early 1960s. And then he goes on to talk about various sort of aspects of British foreign policy. So he mentions the special relationship with the United States. He mentions the Commonwealth, and essentially sort of arguing that this has led to a certain weakness in British foreign policy. The fact that the British were sort of reluctant, as Acheson saw it, to engage in European affairs. This, this he posited was a weakness in British foreign policy. And we'll come back to this idea, but as I said, there is, again, it sort of alludes to these various sort of dimensions of British foreign policy: the Commonwealth, the United States, and Europe. And we talked about Europe in some detail last week already, so I won't regurgitate all of that again. But it sort of nicely sort of illustrates the various, these three, let's say, core dimensions of British foreign policy. Okay, and another chart here before we move on, which, as you can see, nicely illustrates the relative amounts, or I should say the absolute amounts of defence expenditure among various countries in the world. This is 2019, so it's slightly out of date, but I don't think a huge amount has changed in the last couple of years. United States, $732 billion, and as this shows, the United States way above any of its sort of big rivals in terms of the amount it spends on defence. Should be noted, I mean, just as an aside, the figure is slightly misleading because the United States actually pays its soldiers. So a lot of this $732 billion goes on paying things like salaries and pensions and stuff like that. So in that sense, you need to sort of qualify the absolute figure. Nonetheless, even taking that into consideration, the United States still spends much more than any of its rivals. China, second place, 261. The gap between the United States and China sort of closing in recent years, but still, as this figure shows, the US still spending about 3 times more on defense than the Chinese. India in third place, 70 billion. Russia, 65. Saudi Arabia, France, Germany, UK, just under 50 billion. Now, just as a quick aside, as I say, Germany's absolute defence expenditure sort of comparable with the British. It's worth noting, though, that obviously the German economy is significantly larger than Britain's. So in percentage terms, the Germans spend, again, significantly sort of less than the British do on defence. But in absolute terms, because their economy is bigger, they do spend more. Obviously, recently, as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has promised to spend significantly more German money on defence. If that happens, then that will mean that Germany could well become the sort of military heavyweight in European affairs. As it is at the moment, as I say, German and British sort of defence expenditure broadly comparable. The other thing to note about Germany, though, is that Germany is basically a sort of land-based power that Germany, similar to Poland in that sense, that Germany doesn't have much in the way of a coastline, unlike the British, which Britain is an island. We'll come back to that in a moment. So Britain has to devote significant resources to its navy, to its warships. Whereas Germany, German military resources are primarily sort of concentrated on its army, to some extent on its air force, but Germany does not have a particularly significant navy to speak of. But again, that sort of gives you an impression. France, Germany, Britain spending similar amounts on defence. But as I say, unlike Germany, Britain does actually have sort of global interests. It's not completely sort of focused on European affairs. And then below that we've got Japan. Again, Japan's sort of comparable to Germany in the sense of huge economy. Relatively little of the Japanese economy is sort of devoted to defense. In fact, the Japanese constitution prohibits, I think, Japan spending more than 1% of its economy on defense. But because Japan has such a big economy, that 1% still translates into a fairly sort of sizable chunk of money. South Korea, which smaller economy, but the security situation on the Korean Peninsula is such that the government there does actually have to spend a good chunk of money on defense, and then we sort of work our way down. Broad point though is that Britain, as the chart shows, is one of the world's sort of bigger spenders on defense. Certainly inside Europe. Russia, again, interesting. As recent events have revealed, yes, Russia spends more money, despite the fact that the Russian economy is significantly smaller than Britain's. Russia's economy is smaller than that of Italy's. The one thing that the conflict in Ukraine, though, has sort of illustrated is that even though that Russia spends a lot of money on defence, it hasn't really translated into a very sort of effective military force for various reasons, not least corruption and things like that. So again, it's an important, I think, sort of qualifier that absolute sums of money spent on defence don't necessarily translate into an effective military capacity. Another map sort of showing where British soldiers are deployed in different parts of the world. And again, I'll pass over this pretty quickly because I'm spending far too long on this as it is. But the broad point, as the map shows, is that British military forces have a sort of global distribution. All these countries have British military forces. Some of them actually have British military bases. So Germany, there are still, even though the Cold War has long since ended, there are still British forces in Germany. Gibraltar, which is a sort of British colony, just at the southernmost point of Spain. Sierra Leone, Nigeria, etc. Cyprus, which is a former British colony. I should say I can't remember exactly when this chart was produced. So Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Afghanistan, is probably no longer the case because obviously there's been a complete sort of NATO withdrawal from that country fairly recently. But the map sort of gives a nice sort of illustration that, as I said, that there is a sort of global distribution of British military forces. the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Again, interesting because we've recently had the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War. This was a war fought between Britain and Argentina over the Falkland Islands in 1982, and it happens to be one of my first sort of real political memories. I was about 7 at the time, and I remember the news reports. I remember, I suppose the sort of general sense of interest and excitement over surrounding the war in 1982. Another thing worth noting about Britain, which sort of separates Britain from some of its counterparts in the world, is that Britain is a nuclear power. And we have here a photograph of a Trident nuclear submarine. And I believe there are 4 of these submarines, 2 of which, as far as I know, again, obviously a lot of this is sort of clouded in secrecy, but 2 of which are on patrol at any given moment in time. And these submarines carry strategic nuclear missiles. So these are missiles which are capable of inflicting sort of massive devastation. So, were nuclear war ever to break out, God forbid, the British Prime Minister, in theory at least, could order a nuclear strike against Russia or whichever country had launched nuclear missiles against Britain or one of Britain's allies. A couple of qualifying things to say about the British nuclear deterrent. First of all, the British buy their nuclear delivery system, these are the submarines, directly from the United States. So these are not British submarines, well, they are British submarines, but they are not, they're not produced by Britain. They are bought off the shelf, if you like, from the United States. This is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a really interesting reflection of Britain's relationship with the United States because America does not sell these sort of systems to any other country. So it's only the British who actually are, the Americans, let's say, are willing to sell these sort of systems to. Trident, it should be said, well, at the time, it was sort of brought online, I think, in the late 1980s. But at the time, it was sort of state of the art. State of the art meaning it was sort of cutting edge technology, the most advanced. Obviously, it's getting pretty old now, and the British have been sort of in negotiations with Washington over the next sort of generation, which presumably, again, I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but which presumably at some point will come online in the next 20 years or so. So as I said, the British, Washington sells them. The United States sells this system to the British. The British don't, though, actually have their own sort of unique nuclear delivery system. Unlike France, the French under Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s were adamant that the French, French nuclear missiles and the delivery system actually had to be French. De Gaulle was not willing to simply purchase them from Washington, even though Kennedy offered a similar deal to the French than the British. And that sort of raises the question as to just how independent is the British independent nuclear deterrent, given the fact that the British, first of all, they're reliant on Washington to supply them with the nuclear, with this delivery system. They're also very dependent on Washington for maintenance. It requires these systems require lots and lots of technical stuff, which I don't claim to understand, but it basically requires the Americans to sort of service this nuclear system. So that sort of raises questions about just how, just how independent the British system is. Nonetheless, Britain is one of a fairly small group of countries which actually has possession of nuclear weapons. It's one of the, it's one of the established nuclear weapon states, in the sense that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1968, recognises Britain as a nuclear power, along with the United States, Russia, China, France, and, of course, the United States. How important this... Sorry, my phone is not on silent. How important this is in terms of British foreign policy is open to question. Defenders would say, yes, it gives Britain a louder voice on the world stage, the fact that Britain has these weapons. Others would say it's a complete waste of money, that Britain doesn't really benefit at all from it, and the fact is that these weapons are virtually unusable anyway. And I mean, if you look at the sort of history, it's not clear that these weapons provide much of a deterrent. Deterrent meaning that countries won't attack Britain because Britain has nuclear weapons. Argentina, for example, invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, even though Britain had nuclear weapons. And as far as we know, anyway, Margaret Thatcher never seriously contemplated launching a nuclear strike against Buenos Aires. So, as I say, there's some debate about quite how significant it is, but as I say, supporters of Britain's nuclear deterrent would argue that actually, similar to the sort of P5 status on the United Nations, this is something that sort of separates Britain from the rest of the world. And very quickly, another chart as well, sort of showing the world's biggest economies, this time 2020. Again, it sort of depends on how you measure this. These, I think, is in sort of absolute terms, so nominal US dollar exchange rates. If you do it on the basis of purchasing power parities, which is a sort of economic measure of exchange rate, which I'm not going to even bother trying to explain. But by that measure, China actually does have a slightly larger economy than the United States. But anyway, we'll use this chart for the moment. And again, this sort of illustrates the fact that in 2020, at least, the UK economy was number 5 in the world, just behind Germany. Well, I say just behind, but actually quite a significantly less than Germany. But ahead of India, France, Italy, which again sort of reflects the fact that, as I say, Britain, even we talk a lot about British decline and all the rest of it, but Britain still has one of the world's bigger economies, and that of course gives Britain a certain sort of stature and influence on the world stage. As I say, it depends on how you sort of measure these sorts of things. By other measurements, probably Britain may well be slightly lower down on the rankings, but it sort of illustrates the fact that Britain again has a certain amount of weight. I mean, obviously there are bigger economies, Germany and Japan, aside from the United States and China, but Britain is not sort of negligible, let's say, in terms of its economic weight within the international system. G20 2015, so an older photograph here, but sort of illustrating the various countries. As I said, this is a sort of wider club. We've got Barack Obama right in the middle there, Vladimir Putin on the front row. I'm not sure if he's going to be invited to future conferences. I guess not, or at least I find it. I think it's going to be unlikely that any Western country would be willing to share the stage with him. And then various others. There's Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, on the second row. I think that is. I'm never sure how to pronounce his name. Abe or Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister. Merkel, obviously, right in the middle there. I think that's Erdogan, isn't it? The Turkish president. So a sort of group of countries there all gathered together. And again, Britain among them, unsurprisingly, given that Britain, as I said, has one of the world's sort of larger economies, and another forum, let's say, in which Britain sort of expresses its weight. Worth noting that the EU as a whole is also represented at the G20. So even though there are countries like Spain, which has a fairly big economy, sort of comparable, I suppose, to that of Italy, maybe a bit smaller, but doesn't actually have its own place. But there is a sort of EU. The EU as a whole is sort of represented. There's an EU flag there as well. So the president of the European Commission, and I think the European Council, and that lady there, whose name I can never remember, but French lady, who is the president of the European Central Bank now, although she might have been head of the International Monetary Fund. Now I think about it, when this photograph was taken. Right. But again, sort of illustrates the fact that, yeah, another forum. Similarly, as I mentioned earlier, the Commonwealth. So, yeah, all countries which, for the most part, were members of, members, were former colonies, I should say, of the British Empire. Not all of them. Some are, I say some, but one or two. There are one or two sort of recent additions which are, if you like, sort of developing economies which were never formally part of the British Empire, but who have sort of decided that actually they would like to be members of the club. Mozambique is one of them, which Mozambique was actually a Portuguese colony, so it had nothing to do with Britain, but which joined the Commonwealth. But as I say, most of the others, vast majority, I should say, of the others are former colonies. They include countries like Canada, I should say, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Britain. Obviously, these are, if you like, the sort of white English-speaking countries, and then plenty of other countries in Africa, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, bits of South America, obviously the Caribbean we mentioned earlier, which are also sort of present. And you can see all these sort of blue dots sort of all the way across the map: Pacific, Indian Ocean, etc. Again, sort of reflecting, if you like, sort of Britain's sort of global presence. And the Commonwealth, it's, I would say it's largely sort of symbolic in terms of its membership. It doesn't have a huge, it's not like the European Union, let's say, which makes, very obvious, important policy decisions which sort of have ramifications. For Commonwealth, there are sort of annual gatherings of the Commonwealth heads of government, and it plays, it has influence, but it doesn't have a huge amount of sort of political weight. Often, actually, Commonwealth meetings you find there's an awful lot of sort of wrangling between, if you like, the sort of developing countries in Africa and in Southern Asia and places like that, and the more sort of mature economies, so Britain, Australia, Canada, etc. It does have a certain use, though, in the sense that because it is quite diverse, given, as I say, you've got sort of Europeans, North Americans sort of rubbing shoulders, to use an English expression, with African countries and Caribbean and Southern Asian countries. So there is a certain value in sort of bringing this sort of fairly diverse group of countries together to discuss sort of common issues. But I would not want to sort of exaggerate its sort of political importance or its political sort of weight. Probably the aspect in which the Commonwealth makes the sort of biggest impression is the Commonwealth Games, which is, if you like, a sort of poor man's version of the Olympic Games, which is held every 4 years. And so it's an athletics competition and various other sporting competitions, which obviously sort of involve the various Commonwealth countries. Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, 2013. So again, all the people in this photograph are sort of heads of Commonwealth governments. I'm just trying to make out where are the British in this picture. Obviously, you've got Prince Charles, who was deputising for the Queen. It used to be the Queen, who is head of the Commonwealth, who would attend these meetings. She's obviously getting on a bit now, and even though this was 8 or 9 years ago, clearly Charles was already at this stage beginning to sort of step in and deputise for her. And presumably the British Prime Minister is there somewhere. But 2000, this would be Cameron. Oh, there he is. I've found him. Yes. Okay. Yes, he's just in the middle there. And presumably Trudeau is there as well. as the Prime Minister of Australia. Prime Minister of Canada, not Australia. But I can't see him. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah, these, as I say, these are all the sort of heads of government, and yeah, these meetings take place. Actually, I think I think it's on a biannual basis, so every 2 years, not every year. But yeah, these are quite important gatherings. And as I say, the picture here, I think it sort of nicely reflects the sort of diversity of. Right, okay, to the slides. Lost 50 minutes in, and we're getting there. Right. Who makes foreign policy? Constitutionally, it's the responsibility of the Foreign Secretary. So that's basically Britain's Foreign Minister. And the current Secretary of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Actually, its name has recently changed because the Foreign Office now has responsible for development. Development used to be part of a separate department, but it's now been sort of incorporated into the Foreign Office as well. And the current Foreign Secretary is Liz Truss, and she is relatively new to the job. She replaced Dominic Raab a few months ago as Foreign Secretary. And Foreign Secretary is regarded as one of the most important jobs in the British government. I would say, this is my personal view now, but it's not a sort of academic view, but I would say it's in terms of the hierarchy within the British government, it's probably the number 3 job. So Prime Minister, obviously at the top. I would say Chancellor of the Exchequer is probably the number 2 job in the British government, and Foreign Secretary, I would say, is probably number 3. Arguably Home Secretary, which is the other great office of state. The Home Secretary is obviously in charge of the police and things like that. Might be on a similar level, but I think the Foreign Secretary perhaps carries a bit more prestige and cachet than the Foreign Secretary. It's certainly the job that many politicians would really like to have. And Liz Truss has certainly enjoyed her time as Foreign Secretary thus far. There's been plenty of photographs of her, and she has quite a busy Instagram account, and she's liked having photographs of her taken in Moscow and various other places. It should be said, Liz Truss, I think many people think that she is sort of angling for the job of Prime Minister eventually, so she's quite keen to sort of promote her own standing, let's say, within the government. So as I say, Foreign Secretary, one of the big jobs in the British government. On the other hand, it's a job which is often sort of eclipsed by the Prime Minister, because the big foreign policy decisions are often taken by the head of government. I think this is true in most countries. So there is a sort of tension, I would say, between the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister. If an international treaty has to be signed or something like that. I mean, we started the beginning of the class with Boris Johnson, who is Prime Minister. He's not Foreign Secretary. He's the Prime Minister visiting Finland and Sweden. So sometimes it's the Prime Minister who, as I say, it's the Prime Minister who takes the big decisions more often than not. So in that sense, the Foreign Secretary is sort of relegated to a secondary role. On the other hand, of course, it's the Foreign Secretary who's responsible for the day-to-day management of Britain's foreign policy. So, and the Foreign Secretary, he or she, and Britain now has had, I'm trying to think, at least one other woman Foreign Secretary, because Margaret Beckett was Foreign Secretary. I'm feeling there might have been another one as well, but I can't remember. Anyway, Liz Truss certainly isn't the first woman to hold the job. And you often find that Prime Ministers themselves take a pretty keen interest in foreign affairs. That was certainly true, as I said, there with Margaret Thatcher. Tony Blair was very much, I think, a foreign policy Prime Minister, especially after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks, because under Tony Blair, Britain played quite an important role in the war on terror and things like that. Prime ministers often represent Britain at important international summits as well. So, as I say, there's a sort of tension there between the foreign secretary and the prime minister as to who is the one who's sort of taking the lead when it comes to foreign policy. Arguably, it sort of depends on the prime minister. Some prime ministers perhaps have been less interested in foreign policy and are more content to allow their foreign secretaries to sort of play a bigger role, if not the leading role. Others quite like the limelight for themselves. The national interest. So yeah, realist writers argue that states pursue the national interest. So in that sense, every government is pretty much the same. On the other hand, which is the second point here, it's the politicians who define what the national interest is. And I think Brexit is a nice illustration of that. I mean, British politics is pretty divided between those who think Brexit has been a success and a good idea, and those who think that no, it hasn't been a good idea and that it has weakened Britain. And both sides would argue in terms of the national interest. You know, pro-Brexit would say it's been in Britain's interest to leave the European Union. Those against it would say, no, it's been in Britain's interest to stay. So the national interest itself is very much a sort of political concept. And, you know, you can define the national interest in any number of ways depending on your own particular sort of political viewpoint. So I would argue, contrary to sort of realist writers, that trying to explain foreign policy purely in terms of the national interest is not, you know, it doesn't really work, because interests, as I say, are very sort of dependent upon your own sort of political views. So I say, third point there, in practice, several factors influence foreign policy, and these could be various international institutions which a country might belong to, INGOs, which are international non-governmental organisations, multinational corporations, the media, etc. So yeah, so as I say, obviously different factors which influence foreign policy, and that would be my next sort of question to you if we were in class. You know, what factors affect foreign policy? My starting point for almost any country actually is geography. So where a country is sort of geographically located makes a big impact in terms of its foreign policy. We mentioned Germany earlier, which is obviously, like Poland, which is obviously very much a sort of continental power. Britain, an island, and historically that has obviously made a big difference in terms of British foreign policy. It's obviously not a coincidence that historically Britain has been a maritime power, meaning that Britain has sort of relied very heavily on its navy, unlike many other continental countries where the army has been much more important than the navy. And obviously that's a result of its geography. The fact is that Britain is an island. It has thousands and thousands of miles of coast. And therefore, you know, that has made a difference in terms of the way the British have defined their interests. So historically, the British have not really had a huge land-based army. They've concentrated most of their resources on their navy. And that also accounts for the fact that why Britain, you know, ultimately emerged to become a maritime power and a colonial power. You know, it was the British Navy which sort of expanded British influence beyond Europe into North America, Southern Asia, the Pacific, and these various other parts of the world. The other thing to note about Britain being an island, I've said this before, but I'll say this again, is that unlike other European countries, Britain has not really been occupied or invaded for the best part of 1,000 years. 1066 was really the last time that a foreign power overthrew, you know, I was going to say British government, but Britain didn't really exist back then. Okay, but let's say, you know, an Anglo-Saxon monarchy. Let's put it that way. Or even that is slightly misleading because it was Actually, it was a sort of Viking one. Anyway, leaving that aside, leaving that aside, 1066 was the last time that a foreign power sort of really sort of overthrew. Again, that is a slightly tendentious claim. There are other instances, not least the Glorious Revolution, 1688, and one or two other instances where you could put question marks over that claim. But broadly speaking, Britain hasn't really had these sort of foreign invasions and interventions by foreign powers that other European countries, not least Poland, have sort of experienced throughout the centuries. So aside from the geography, there is also history, which is an important factor when it comes to explaining, I would say, any state's foreign policy, but it's certainly true of Britain. And a couple of quick points here. Britain, obviously, in earlier periods of its history, used to be a world power. And the 19th century was very much the heyday, meaning this was the moment in Britain's history where British power was at its maximum. So really from mid to into the first half of the 20th century, Britain possesses a global empire as well, which still has quite important consequences for British foreign policy. We'll come on to that in a moment. But the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, is really often viewed as a period of British decline. So obviously Britain was on the winning side during the Second World War. But thereafter, Britain sort of begins to decline relatively when you look at other sort of big powers in the international system, like the Soviet Union, the United States, Japan, Germany, which emerge as economic powerhouses after the Second World War. So the history, as I say, the history still very much matters when one thinks about British foreign policy today. And one of the consequences of British history is, well, as the title of the slide here says, Britain, Island, World, Island. I'm borrowing this these words from Timothy Garton Ash. The empire had a number of consequences. One is the fact that British culture, in some ways, became a sort of global culture, not least, of course, because English has become the world's sort of lingua franca, meaning that it tends to be the language used in business and many other activities across the world. There are also plenty of English-speaking countries as well, and that's obviously as a consequence of the empire. So obviously North America, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, but even countries like India, where the official language is English, parts of the Caribbean and things like that. So English has become a sort of global language, and that certainly gives Britain certain sort of advantages when it comes to its foreign relations. And then there's the fact that many people who lived in the British Empire actually immigrated to Britain in the second half of the 20th century. So as Timothy Garton Ash puts it, the Britain went out to the world, and then the world came back to Britain. And one fascinating statistic is, which I've put on the slide there, is that more than 300 different languages are spoken in London, which again sort of reflects the diversity of the communities in London. London is the world's most diverse city after New York. But there's a certain tension between the world and the islands, simply because, and we mentioned this when we talked a little bit about Brexit, immigration has become quite a contentious issue in British politics, and a lot of British people are unhappy, let's say, about the sort of cosmopolitan nature of Britain today. Thinking about Britain's place in the world today, well, as I say on the first point there, I think most people would agree that Britain today is a sort of second-tier power. So obviously you've got the United States, China as being the two big powers in the contemporary international system. Britain, you would probably say, is somewhere on the sort of second tier. along with countries like France, Germany, Italy perhaps, etc. Britain has a big economy, relatively speaking, larger than Russia's, for example. And we saw some of the statistics for that earlier. Relatively large spender on defence, nuclear power, and all these things. So that gives Britain a certain weight, although again, we should be careful not to exaggerate. Obviously, British power is dwarfed by that of the United States and to a large extent China as well. Nonetheless, British governments like to argue that Britain, as they say, punches above its weight, meaning that perhaps Britain has a bit more influence in international affairs than its economic and military size would suggest. And there are a couple of reasons why this argument is proposed, not least the fact that Britain plays quite an important role in several international organisations. I think we mentioned earlier that Britain is a P5 member of the United Nations Security Council. NATO, we mentioned, obviously no longer a member of the European Union, and critics might argue that that has perhaps diminished Britain's standing to some extent. But nonetheless, plays a significant role in a number of international institutions. And the legacy of empire means that Britain still does actually have some influence in different parts of the world, not least the Middle East, where Britain historically has had quite close ties with a number of governments in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, to some extent also in Southern Asia, East Asia as well, for that matter. So the legacy of empire, to some extent, again, I would not want to exaggerate the influence, but it's there, definitely. And as I say, that's a consequence of Britain's past and its historical, let's say, global interest. And Winston Churchill, no less, liked to argue that Britain was in the middle of, as he put it, three concentric circles. So he said, I don't know how clearly you can see this graph I very crudely drew, but you have the United States representing one circle, the Commonwealth on the other, and Europe on the other, and Britain having important relationships with all three. Well, we talked about Europe before last week, so we will not delve into that again. Let's consider the Commonwealth and the United States, though. So the Commonwealth, as we mentioned earlier, sort of evolved from the British Empire. So as Britain decolonised, or went through this process of decolonisation in the 1950s, 60s, couple of decades after the Second World War, the empire effectively became a commonwealth of independent states, if I can put it that way, or mainly, let's say, independent states. And the hope was that the Commonwealth would become this sort of wide, big sort of international bloc, perhaps a trading bloc, and that the Britain would continue to play a sort of very influential role within it. And I think we talked about this before, but that was one reason why the British in the 1950s and early 1960s were not that interested in the idea of European integration. However, the Commonwealth didn't really ever live up to expectations. It never really did turn into this sort of powerful bloc, which again I think accounts for the fact that by the mid to late 60s, the British decided that they would actually have to commit themselves to entering the European community. And one problem was that obviously many of the countries which were Commonwealth members were quite sceptical about the idea of British leadership, unsurprisingly, given their former relationship with Britain. So the Commonwealth, obviously it's still there, it does play a relatively important role, let's say, in international affairs, but it certainly didn't translate into this sort of very tightly knit bloc, which I think the British as I say, in the years after the Second World War, were hoping that it would become. And I think many historians trace the moment that Britain becomes less of a global power and more a regional power in Europe to the late 1960s. And this, the key date is around 1968. And the British government announced that it was going to close a number of military bases in Asia and the Middle East. So this is the moment where you could talk, if you like, about a retrenchment in British power. This was the moment where the British realised that they were no longer economically strong enough to have a sort of worldwide network of bases and things like that. So thereafter, British global British global influence was significantly reduced, as I say there. And again, it's no accident that a few years later that the British joined the European Economic Community. So really, since the early 1970s, the British sort of viewed themselves as more or less a sort of regional power or a European power. But as I noted before, residuals of Britain's former influence in different parts of the world still remain. So the legacy of empire still counts for something in terms of British relations with various states in Asia, Africa, etc. The other important aspect of British foreign policy is the so-called special relationship with the United States. And again, this has a long history behind it. It should be noted that Britain and the United States were not always friends. In fact, obviously, a war was fought between the British and the Americans in the late 18th century, which ultimately leads to the establishment of the United States of America. And the friendship, if you like, between the two countries really only is established in the 20th century. And arguably, it's not really until the Second World War that the special relationship that we talk about today comes to fruition. It's Churchill, again, it's usually Churchill who's sort of related to all these sort of foreign policy traditions. It's Churchill who uses this phrase in a famous speech that he gives in Fulton, Missouri. In 1946. The speech is actually best remembered for the phrase "the Iron Curtain," which Churchill uses publicly, let's say, for the first time. But in the speech, he also argues that Britain and the United States should forge a special relationship, and he says. He very much couches it in terms of security. This is obviously the moment where the Cold War is just beginning, that relations between the United States and Britain and Stalin's Soviet Union are beginning to break down. So Churchill essentially arguing that there needs to be a special relationship and a special, if you like, military alliance between the two countries. And that, to a large extent, sort of emerges from the war as well. Obviously, Britain and the United States fought together against Nazi Germany. And this is the war, really, that lays the foundations for the post-war relationship between the two countries. So there's a quotation here from Alex Danchev, a well-known sort of British historian on the special relationship, who says, "Whatever was special about the special relationship was learned in the schoolroom of the Grand Alliance." Harold Macmillan, an important sort of British Prime Minister in the mid-50s, early 1960s, he was somebody who, like Churchill, was very committed to the special relationship. And like Churchill, he had a sort of genetic connection because his mother was American, like Churchill's mother. And this is a very well-known sort of quotation from Macmillan, in which he basically makes the analogy between the American Empire and the Roman Empire. And he says that Britain, in relation to the American Empire, was similar to the Greeks in the Roman Empire. So Macmillan often sort of made this analogy: the British were the Greeks in the new American Empire. What makes the relationship special? First of all, very intense diplomatic contacts between the British and the Americans. Obviously, the fact that there's a shared language goes a long way towards sort of facilitating the relationship. And I've actually spoken to a couple of American diplomats directly who made this point themselves. They say that yes, Britain is actually treated quite differently from virtually any other country as far as the United States is concerned. Another way that Britain is special, I mentioned this earlier, but Britain is the only country allowed to purchase American nuclear technology or American nuclear delivery system in the form of Trident submarines. And there's probably a new generation of submarines which will come online in the next 10, 20 years or so. Nuclear relationship between the two countries, I said the nuclear relationship, but actually nuclear relationship goes back a little bit before that. But the fact that Britain's ability to purchase this dates back to 1963 when Kennedy agreed to sell the Polaris nuclear system to Britain. And as we noted earlier, Britain today has Trident submarines. I didn't put it on the slide, I don't think. I'll just go back a moment just to check. The other really important aspect, though, I didn't put it on the slide, but the other really important aspect is the close intelligence relationship. And the fact is, the United States shares a lot of intelligence. There's a lot of intelligence cooperation between the British and the Americans, and with the other English-speaking countries as well. There is what is known as the Five Eyes. This is the United States, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And all these intelligence services work together quite closely. So intelligence, nuclear, diplomatic cooperation, these are all important elements in the special relationship. There is a debate as to exactly how special the special relationship is. It's certainly more special for the British than the United States, but I think most observers would agree that, as I said a moment ago, that Britain is treated rather differently from other powers or other states in the international system. Thinking about British foreign policy today, Britain still regards itself as having global interests. And again, I think this was quite important in terms of Brexit. I think one of the arguments in favour of Britain leaving the European Union was that it would allow Britain to trade more freely with other parts of the world or to be more engaged in other parts of the world. So Boris Johnson likes to talk a lot about global Britain. So the idea being that we would leave the EU, but we would have if anything, a bigger presence on the global stage. Remains highly sceptical. I think I wrote this pre-Brexit, so obviously that is true. Wants to maintain a close relationship with the United States. Yes, I mean, even with Trump in the White House, Theresa May, Boris Johnson sort of went out of their way to try and maintain a sort of close relationship with the Trump White House. I think relations are slightly more strained between Joe Biden and the current British government. It should be noted Biden has Irish ancestry, and Irish Americans aren't always instinctively pro-British. But also the fact that Boris Johnson seemed to enjoy quite a close relationship with Trump. I don't think that has necessarily endeared him to the current White House. Britain still quite a strong defence policy. Although Britain as a military power is much sort of diminished than it was in earlier periods of its history, even in the 20th century. But Britain did deploy forces to Iraq, Afghanistan, contributed to the NATO intervention in Libya. In fact, David Cameron was one of the sort of driving forces behind the intervention in Libya. So Britain still has sort of pretensions of being able to project military power outside Europe. With Tony Blair, this was especially true. Blair very much committed his government to supporting the United States during the War on Terror. Um, Britain participated in a bombing raid in Iraq in 1998. This was during the Clinton administration. Again, part of the Kosovo War in 1999, intervention in Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. We could take the story on. So Blair was certainly quite a keen advocate of military intervention. I think to some extent Cameron was as well. We noted that under Cameron, Britain participated in the raid in Libya. Cameron was also quite a forceful advocate for some kind of military intervention in Syria. But the British Parliament actually voted against involvement in Syria, and the Obama administration also decided eventually that they weren't going to intervene directly or not send military forces into Syria. I won't go into this. This is fairly way back in history again. As an indication of how long I've been teaching this, but yeah, the war on terror was quite controversial inside Britain, not least because, of course, Britain itself has quite a large Muslim population who were not at all happy with the, I'm generalising now, but many of whom were not at all happy with the military interventions in the Middle East and Southern Asia. Again, this is sort of reference to the Arab Spring and Cameron, and which I mentioned. But yeah, again, there's sort of indication that Britain could play quite an important role in these sort of external sort of military interventions. Although noted there that the British military was sort of badly overstretched, so this was not a mission that the British found quite easily to engage in the bombing raids over Libya in 2011. Okay, I thought I might round it off with a quick mention of Ukraine, because of course, as we mentioned earlier, Britain and Boris Johnson in particular has been in the news quite a lot, given his quite overt support for the Ukrainian government under President Zelensky. One thing to note is that actually Britain's relations with Russia have been bad for a long time, for various reasons, but not least because of several poisonings, assassinations of sort of Russian emigres in Britain. One of the most notable being the poisoning of a former Russian intelligence officer in Salisbury and his daughter, with the use of a Novichok poisoning, which was later revealed quite publicly to have involved Russian intelligence agents. So since then, relations with Russia have been, to say the least, pretty strained. And broadly, the British have been quite supportive of the Ukrainian government and its efforts to sort of resist Russian aggression, Russian intervention in its affairs since 2014. That said, I actually listened to quite an interesting podcast about this very issue. And one of the points that was made was that successive British governments were slightly reluctant to send too much in the way of military support to Ukraine, in the fear that they might actually unduly antagonize Russia. So it's not really until the months before the current Russian invasion of Ukraine that the British policy sort of swung decisively in support of the Ukrainian government. Since then, though, Britain has obviously been shipping quite a lot of weapons to Ukraine. Boris Johnson, whose hero is Winston Churchill, obviously thinks he has the potential to play some kind of historic role in all of this. So yeah, Britain is very much part of the international community's response when it comes to supporting Ukraine. Much more so, it should be added, than certainly Germany. To some extent, also France. I mean, Macron appears to be trying to keep some form of dialogue open with Vladimir Putin, and has sort of mooted the possibility that there should be some kind of peace settlement, and that Russia should perhaps be granted, or at least separatist forces in Ukraine should be granted some extra territory as a way of bringing the war to an end. There doesn't seem to be much sympathy for this view within Britain. The British seem far more willing to assist Ukraine in continuing its war. As I say, it's war with Russia, but encountering the Russian invasion, which is probably a better way of putting it. Which again is interesting. So it sort of underlines the fact that even though Britain is outside the European Union now, it still has the capacity to play quite an important role in the European security system. So the fact that Britain is still a NATO member, and that Britain still is able to sort of play this role is I think quite important. Okay, I think I will bring it to an end there.